Patrol lights swept across the mansion gate, and two officers growled, aiming their guns at a black man who had just stepped out of his car. "Hands where I can see them. What house is this black bastard trying to rob?" Halper barked, his voice pounding like a hammer. Anthony Cole stood tall, heavy rain pouring over his shoulders, his eyes cold. "This is my house." Miller spat on the ground, letting out a contemptuous laugh. "Your house? That mouth of yours lies even better than it steals." Anthony raised his leather wallet, words slicing through clenched teeth. "You just picked the wrong man to insult. I am the director of the FBI. Rain poured heavily, the road glistening under the pale yellow glow cast from a street lamp. A black SUV pulled up in front of a secluded mansion at the end of a quiet street. Anthony Cole opened the car door. His tall figure stepped out, a long trench coat soaked through, wet hair clinging heavily, each drop of rain falling in rhythm with his steps toward the iron gate. His hand reached out, fingers brushing the recognition keypad. A dry electronic beep sounded. The gate began to move, but at that exact moment, red and blue lights swept in, blending with the screech of tires on the wet pavement. The patrol car stopped by the curb, and two figures stepped out, boots thudding against the soaked ground. Roy Halper, broad-shouldered with bloodshot eyes, raised his pistol, shouting loud enough to shake the street. "Hands where I can see them. What house is this black bastard trying to rob?" The words rang out with the rain, part command, part open insult. Beside him, Miller Grant, thinner but with a venomous stare, also raised his weapon, aiming it straight at Anthony. Anthony stood firm, his expression unchanged, rain trailing down his forehead, dripping from the bridge of his nose, his eyes cold as steel. He spoke slowly, his voice hoarse but steady. "This is my house." A simple answer, yet it drew a mocking laugh from Halper, a dry, sharp sound. "Your house? Don't lie to me. A black man living in this neighborhood? It's all rich white folks here. Who do you think you are walking in like that?" Miller spat on the tiled ground, gripping his gun tighter, his words crude and sharp like a knife slicing through the rain. "Where's the paperwork? Or are you sneaking in to steal and pretending this place is yours?" Anthony exhaled, the sound of his breath audible in the rain-soaked air. He didn't move, forward or back, only kept his eyes fixed on the two officers ready to shoot. The headlights from the patrol car swept across, casting his shadow tall and straight against the iron gate. In that moment, the silence between the pounding rain made the tension worse. Neighbors peeked through windows, faint faces behind the glass, but the second they saw the guns, curtains snapped shut, leaving only darkness and familiar cowardice. Halper stepped closer, his voice louder, harsher. "This is your last warning. Get down. Hands behind your head or I'll shoot." Miller shouted after him, "On your knees, bastard. You think the law's just decoration?" Guns raised, fingers on the triggers, cold black metal catching the streetlight's reflection. Anthony curled his lip, eyes flashing with a chilling glare. Each word he spoke cut through the rain like ice. "I will not kneel in my own house." That sentence hit like a blow in reverse, making Halper explode with rage, his face flushed red, eyes flaring with madness. He clenched his teeth, his voice growling. "That attitude means resisting orders. You want to die?" Miller laughed harshly, raising the butt of his gun slightly, eyeing Anthony like a predator watching prey about to break. "Look at this, Roy. He's still trying to push back. I bet he'll be crying in no time." Anthony kept his back straight, one hand resting lightly on the electronic lock that had just opened, the iron gate creaking aside, confirming the simple truth that this was his home. The mechanical hum echoed through the space, but Halper shouted over it, "Cut that act right now. Don't think cheap tech will hide the truth. You don't belong here." Anthony looked at him, no fear in his eyes, only a deep contempt. "You've just made a serious mistake." His voice wasn't loud, but the rain seemed to pause for a moment, making room for a heaviness that pressed down on the chests of those watching from afar. Halper stepped in. The butt of his gun slammed hard into Anthony's shoulder, a sharp crack sounding through the night. The blow made Anthony stumble half a step back, but he immediately steadied himself, eyes burning hotter. His breath grew heavier, then suddenly slowed, like a cornered beast waiting to strike. Miller sneered, his voice slicing through the rain. "Who do you think you are? Some rich black guy living off the system? Tonight I'll prove you're nothing but trash." Anthony stared straight at them, his eyes filled with a resolve that made both officers falter for a second. He reached into his trench coat, the movement slow but certain. Instantly, both guns raised, Halper shouted like thunder, "Don't move! One move and I'll shoot!" But Anthony didn't stop. His hand pulled out a black leather wallet, flipped it open, the streetlight catching the golden badge inside. He held it high, his voice low but ringing like an order. "You boys are done. I'm the director of the FBI." In that moment, the world froze. Rain kept falling, but no one noticed the sound anymore. Halper stared wide-eyed, his gun trembling in his grip despite how tightly he held it. Miller's mouth dropped open, arrogance wiped away by stunned disbelief. Standing before them wasn't the black suspect they thought, but the man holding the highest authority in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Anthony's gaze bore into them, a look that didn't need to shout to crush their pride. Every insult, every mocking word they had just thrown in that single instant became a heavy collar around their own necks. No one spoke, but the entire street could feel the sharp crack of arrogance breaking apart inside the two men standing in the rain, guns still raised, now too afraid to pull the trigger. Rain kept pounding on the awning, drumming fast and hard, drowning out the sound of tense breathing. Roy Halper stepped forward, gun raised, his voice roared over the rain, "On your knees, hands behind your head." The command echoed down the empty street, blending with the flashing lights from the patrol car, turning the scene suffocating. Halper leaned forward, his entire body tense like a wire on the verge of snapping, his eyes blazing, ready to seize any excuse to act. Miller stood off to the side, rain streaming down his face, yet a faint smirk remained, his gaze locked like a predator watching its target. Anthony Cole did not move, his hand still holding up the leather wallet, the FBI badge glinting under the light, the metallic shine flashing like a silent challenge. He drew in a deep breath, his broad shoulders rising, then calmly responded in a hoarse but firm voice, "I will not kneel in my own house." Each word hit the wet pavement like heavy stones, thickening the already weighted air. That answer was not a shout, not a plea, but a solid declaration, a refusal to be brought low on the doorstep of his own home. Miller let out a dry laugh, a hollow sound that made the darkness feel even heavier. "You hear that, Roy? He thinks he can stand tall and ignore the order. That's resisting. That's a clear crime." He tilted his gun slightly, as if teasing, as if the slightest motion would be enough to crush the pride standing in front of him. Halper followed up, his voice slicing the air like a blade. "That attitude just proves he wants to play hero. But here, we are the law." He tilted his head, glanced at Miller, then snapped back with another shout, "Last chance, get on your knees." Anthony looked straight into Halper's rage-filled eyes, and in his own, a flash of restrained fury sparked. He didn't take a step back, and his voice rose slowly, every word etched like stone. "Are you here to uphold justice with guns, or to prove to the world that police exist to humiliate the people?" His breath was heavy, blending with the downpour, echoing into the hearts of those silently watching. At that moment, a few windows across the street creaked open, shadows of people peeking out, eyes wide, but within seconds the curtains snapped shut. Fear was written all over them. No one dared speak up. Halper hissed, his voice cracking like the roar of a provoked beast. "Everyone will see you're just a useless liar living off your slick mouth. Around here, your skin already decided you were born to kneel." He stepped even closer, only a few feet away now, the gun nearly pressed to Anthony's chest. Miller cut in, backing up his partner. "Try opening that arrogant mouth one more time and I'll blow it off." He snarled each word, his eyes gleaming with cruel delight, as if savoring the rush of power in this one-sided standoff. Anthony tilted his head, looking directly at the two men before him, his eyes burning with fire, yet still in control. He didn't shout, didn't step back, only spoke clearly enough for the whole street to hear. "You are repeating the same mistake history has warned against time and time again. This mistake will drag you both down." His voice was steady, not trembling, not weak, but so certain it was frightening. Halper smirked, but the smile was twisted, an attempt to cover the trembling rising from deep inside him. The rain kept falling, heavier, blending with the flashing lights to create a scene straight out of a nightmare. An old woman peeked out from the corner of the street, her aged eyes watching, lips parting as if to speak, but then she slammed her door shut in fear. The street fell silent. Only the shouting, the rain, and the pounding hearts of those hiding behind curtains remained. That silence of complicity weighed on Anthony, but he knew it was exactly what had kept men like Halper and Miller drunk on power. Halper growled, his eyes bloodshot. "You've got 3 seconds. If you don't kneel, you die here." He raised his hand and started to count. 3, 2, his voice echoed, sharp and pounding like a hammer to the chest. Miller joined in, shouting with wild excitement. 1! His gun jerked slightly, finger pressing hard against the trigger. In that split second, the air seemed to shatter. Breaths held across the street. Eyes behind curtains flinched and shrank in fear. Anthony didn't kneel, didn't flinch. He raised his chin, staring straight into the barrels of their guns. His hand clenched the leather wallet, the FBI badge still gleaming, and he said each word with chilling clarity, "Go ahead. And when the shot is fired, all you'll have left is disgrace burned into your badge forever." The sentence made them both hesitate. A brief moment, but enough to reveal their doubt. Halper hissed through clenched teeth, gun shaking violently in his grip. Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting as if he just realized he had crossed a line with no way back. In that terrifying silence, the iron gate behind Anthony kept moving, the metal groan ringing out like a warning bell for the truth they refused to face. The house opened, light spilling out and shining across Anthony's back, casting a towering, commanding silhouette. Facing that image, the false confidence on Halper and Miller's faces cracked, though they tried to keep their aggression intact, knowing that if they backed down now, all their arrogance would collapse on the spot. Rain still fell. The street stayed quiet, and in that tense, dramatic standoff, only Anthony's cold voice cut through, sharp as a blade. "Justice will never come from the gun of a coward. You've just turned yourselves into a symbol of corruption in that uniform." That sentence ended the waiting, thickening the air until every breath felt like a weight. Halper clenched his jaw, Miller stood speechless, and everyone hiding behind curtains knew that tonight this confrontation was far from over, and no one could tell whether it would end in blood, disgrace, or a shift in history. Rain kept lashing the pavement like a whip, cold, soaking into every muscle. But the real weight in the air didn't come from the storm. It came from the 2 gun barrels still aimed straight at Anthony Cole. Roy Halper sniffed sharply, his eyes full of contempt, tilting his chin toward Anthony, his voice loud and cutting like he wanted the whole neighborhood to hear. "How much is that coat? Shoplift it from the mall, didn't you?" A crooked smile twisted under his tense lips. He stepped back, then forward again, glancing around at the cracked open windows in the dark. He wanted the neighbors to witness this, to make the humiliation not just Anthony's alone, but a public spectacle for all to enjoy. Miller Grant stood off to the side, still gripping his gun, lips curled in a sneer. He burst out laughing, the sound dry and sharp, slicing through the rain like metal on skin. "Got the deed, or just a fake key?" He dragged out each word, tone conjuring the image of a clumsy thief caught red-handed. He was trying to turn Anthony into a joke, a pitiful character in the eyes of everyone secretly watching from the shadows. Anthony didn't reply. He stepped forward to the iron gate, his rain-soaked hand resting on the biometric keypad. A blue light flashed, a clear electronic beep followed, and the steel door slowly opened with a familiar groan. In that moment, the truth stood bare. This was his home, undefeated. undeniable. But Halper narrowed his eyes, venom flashing in his glare, and barked loudly, "Cheap tech doesn't prove you live here." His shrill voice cut through the sound of the gate, desperate to reject the obvious. Miller chimed in, voice thick with mockery. "A fingerprint scanner? Big deal. Flea market junk. Any lowlife can install that crap. You think we trust some stupid beep?" He threw his head back, laughing, the sound echoing through the rain, blending with the red and blue lights and turning the street into a cruel parody of a stage. Anthony didn't yell, didn't argue. He simply stared at the two officers with a frozen gaze. In his eyes, a flash of cold light, contempt held tight under control. He let the sound of the steel gate continue, the silhouette of the mansion emerging steadily behind him through the rain, a silent statement that he alone owned everything they were trying to deny. Halper stepped closer, trying to stain the truth once more, to drag Anthony down from the composure of a man still standing tall. His voice was harsh. "You think dressing like that makes you something? I've seen dozens like you, using nice clothes to hide the filth underneath." Miller gave a dry laugh, his face openly amused, tapping the trigger lightly. "If I shoot you right here, would that house mean anything at all?" Anthony took a deep breath, feeling each word strike like a blade into the core of his pride. But instead of reacting with rage, he responded in a low, steady voice, just loud enough for the two men to hear. "The only thing you've just proven is how hatred blinds you. Even with the truth right in front of you, you still choose mockery." He lifted his chin, letting the rain pour over his cold face as if every drop was washing away the filth of their cruel words. In that brief moment, a few windows cracked open again and eyes stared down at the scene. What they saw was clear. A man standing tall in the rain, firmly unlocking his own gate, and two uniformed officers with guns shouting and ridiculing. But then the curtains quickly fell shut once more, and the complicit silence returned. No one dared speak up, no one dared step out. Halper scoffed, a bitter laugh cut short as he tilted his gun toward Anthony's chest. "Stand there and act wise all you want. We're the ones who decide whether you walk or drop dead on your doorstep." His voice tightened, like a sentence already delivered. Miller nodded along, adding, "That justice you're clinging to? It's just a fantasy. Here, I am the law." Anthony stared into their eyes, his gaze burning like fire in the dark. He raised his hand slowly, placing it on the wide-open gate, then turned back, his voice ringing through the rain. "You're turning yourselves into a global joke. Very soon, the world will see who's really outside the law." The words fell heavy and direct, freezing the moment. Halper clenched his jaw, gripping his gun so tightly the veins in his hand bulged. Miller bit his lip, eyes flashing with anger and fear, but still let out a warped laugh, broken like splintered metal in the rain. They couldn't accept that a black man dared to stand tall, dared to speak back, dared to assert the truth before them. They wanted to crush that, but instead, his calmness was swallowing their aggression whole. The street sank into darkness and rain, broken only by the flashing red and blue lights, the sound of the iron gate fully opening, and the image of Anthony Cole standing firm. He had proven the truth through action, but that truth was not welcomed. Instead, it ignited the fury of men addicted to arrogance and oppression. And that night, the public humiliation wasn't aimed at him alone. It left a scar across the entire street, a place where everyone saw and still chose silence. The iron gate had barely opened before Roy Halper suddenly stepped in hard, his entire body pressing forward as his veined, rough hand shoved straight into Anthony Cole's chest. The heavy force knocked Anthony backward, his shoes slipping on the wet tiles, his body wavering in the rain. Halper didn't miss a beat, roaring with a hoarse voice thick with rage. "Shut your mouth. A black bastard has no right to raise his voice here." The words struck like a blade, not just aimed at Anthony, but slashing through the pride of those silently watching behind their curtains. Every word echoed through the rain, mingling with the flashing red and blue lights, turning the street into a stage for brutal humiliation. Anthony staggered, but quickly found his footing, his eyes flashing with a restrained fury. He growled each word, his voice low and resonant like a bell striking the chest of the men before him. "You are violating the law." It was not a cry for help, not a plea, but a cold declaration. Every word he spoke landed like a hammer blow, cracking the fake mask of power Halper and Miller wore. Miller stepped in, slim but quick. He swung the butt of his gun in a sharp motion, the cold metal slamming hard into Anthony's shoulder. The dry impact rang out against the rain, making the distant onlookers shudder. Anthony dropped slightly, his left shoulder twitching, pain spreading rapidly down his arm, but he made no sound. His fist clenched, his gaze fixed on the two men in front of him like a fire refusing to be drowned out by the storm. Halper grinned smugly, victory painted all over his face. "You think you can teach me the law? What are you to me? Just a black man who doesn't belong here, running his mouth about laws?" He jabbed the barrel of his gun hard into Anthony's chest, forcing him back against the doorstep. Miller stood nearby, sneering. "If I call for backup, in 5 minutes you'll have a dozen guns pointed at your head. Will you still be preaching about the law then?" Anthony exhaled, his breath turning into white mist in the cold, mixing with the rain into thin clouds. He lifted his head, his shoulder throbbing, but his back straight, and spoke clearly, every word deliberate. "The law is not yours to twist, not a tool to turn a citizen into a victim." The words made Miller falter for a split second, his eyes flickering with doubt, but Halper immediately cut in with a furious shout. "Shut your filthy mouth! You dare challenge the police? You just signed your own death sentence." A heavy wave of silence blanketed the entire street. Curtains trembled slightly, and shadows behind the windows held their breath. Everyone knew the situation was spiraling. Fear anchored their feet in the dark. Halper and Miller, soaked in their uniforms, became two shadowy figures of authority, standing there with guns and cruel voices, while Anthony stood alone, unmoving, on the steps of his own home. Miller spun the gun in his hand, the edge of the butt catching the light, and pressed it close to Anthony's cheek as a threat. "Open your mouth again, and I'll leave a mark on your face to remind you who really owns this place." His voice hissed through a sharp laugh, cold and unsettling. Anthony stared directly at him, his gaze filled with deep contempt, and answered calmly, "You've just turned ignorance into a weapon, and that weapon will destroy you." His words made Halper snap, roaring like a provoked beast. His body shook, finger tight on the trigger, gun raised close to Anthony's face. His rage showed in every twitch of his muscles. Miller shouted, voice charged with excitement, "Shoot him, Roy! Teach him a lesson." His aggression poured gasoline on the fire burning in his partner's eyes. Still, Anthony didn't back down. His eyes shone fiercely, radiating an invisible force that made both men blink instinctively. He spoke low but firm. "If you pull that trigger now, you'll stain history with something that cannot be erased, and that truth will follow you for the rest of your life." His voice echoed in the rain, like a cold declaration carved into the storm. The standoff stretched on, like a taut wire ready to snap. Halper gritted his teeth, eyes bloodshot, but the gun in his hand stopped short, unable to fire. Miller bit his lip, his face twitching, eyes darting away for a brief moment. Anthony's steady presence, charged with quiet authority, had pushed them into unexpected territory, shaking their arrogance to the core. Rain poured harder, pounding like war drums. Cold air stabbed into their lungs, their breath mingling into a whirlpool of tension. Anthony, shoulders still burning from the rifle butt, stood firm, eyes bright, spine straight. Halper and Miller, armed and furious, suddenly looked small in the thick silence. This wasn't just a clash of bodies, but a collision between crushed pride and rotting power. That rainy night, right at the doorstep of a luxury home, the truth became clear. Two officers using violence to hold on to the illusion of power, and Anthony Cole, standing like a rock in the current, armed only with his voice and his gaze. And from this moment on, the encounter was no longer just a routine check. It had become the first tremor of a coming storm, one that would break far beyond the limits of this rainy little street. The rain grew heavier, pounding on the awning and splashing across the pavement lit by scattered streetlights, like thousands of urgent drum beats. Anthony Cole still stood tall, his breathing sharp from the blow of the rifle butt that still burned in his shoulder, but his feet had not moved an inch. He held his balance with sheer willpower, eyes bloodshot, face soaked in rain mixed with restrained fury. Halper stepped in closer, the gun in his hand trembling from tension, and he shouted, his voice hoarse with overflowing rage, "One more move and I shoot!" His scream tore through the thickened air, slamming shut every window that had dared crack open, leaving only trembling silhouettes behind the curtains. Anthony stared straight at the black barrel aimed at his chest. He knew that a single pull of the trigger could stain the tiles with blood right at his doorstep, but fear could not rise higher than the pride swelling inside him. His hand slowly moved toward his chest, every motion a challenge, a silent message that he would not yield to armed ignorance. Halper squinted, his finger growing heavier on the trigger, shouting again, "Stay still! Don't try to be a hero!" Miller shouted too, trying to overpower the rain. "One move and I'll blow your head off." But Anthony had already made his choice. He pulled a black leather wallet from his chest, the movement deliberate. Not fast, not slow, just enough for the patrol car's lights to catch it. The wallet snapped open, revealing a badge that gleamed brightly, its engraved letters shining under the dim light. Anthony raised it high, his arm steady as steel, his voice cutting clear through the air, cold and sharp, each word precise. "You boys are done. I'm the director of the FBI." The words struck like lightning, ripping through the dark sky. For a moment, every other sound faded, leaving only the echo of a truth now fully revealed. Halper froze, his gun still pointed, but his hand shook visibly. Miller's mouth dropped open, the sneer wiped clean, his eyes scattered like someone suddenly pulled from a daze. Anthony lowered his gaze onto the two men now frozen in place, his eyes like blades digging deep into their crumbling arrogance. He stood firm, the badge still raised, its light casting across his cold, determined face. The two guns were still aimed at him, but in that moment they were no longer symbols of power, just meaningless pieces of metal in the hands of men who had just been exposed. The rain kept falling, pouring down in sheets, but it was as if no one could hear it anymore. Halper swallowed hard, his flushed face turning pale. He didn't dare blink, because every blink felt like admitting a mistake too big to undo. Miller stepped back half a pace, still gripping his gun, but his eyes wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind. The air was so tense it could be sliced apart, and the silence became the heaviest judgment of all. Anthony still didn't lower his hand. He held his stance, face hardened, his voice rang out again, striking deep into the minds of the two officers. "You've just committed the unforgivable, using weapons to humiliate a citizen inside his own home. But this time, the man you tried to disgrace is the director of the FBI." The windows creaked open once more, this time staying open longer, eyes from the darkness staring out in disbelief. A few sharp breaths could be heard from a distance. Someone dropped a cup in their kitchen, the sound sharp and echoing into the street. Everyone understood that the moment had passed beyond a confrontation between a citizen and the police. It had become a shift in power, a complete reversal playing out before their eyes. Halper inhaled sharply, trying to find his voice, but his throat was dry, and when he finally spoke, it came out shaky. You're lying. You think flashing a badge is enough to fool us?" But his hand trembled, and the gun could no longer stay steady. Miller forced a weak smile, his voice cracking. "Director of the FBI? Sounds like a joke." But when the light from the street lamp hit the badge clearly, the truth stood undeniable, and they both knew denial was useless now. Anthony looked at them, his gaze devoid of pity, filled only with unwavering resolve. He lowered the hand holding the badge, his voice dropping low. "I've been patient with you long enough. Now it's your turn to face the consequences." That statement froze Halper Halper and Miller in place, their hands still gripping their guns, but their bodies had no strength left to take another step. The rain kept hammering down, lights still flashing, but the entire scene was now swallowed by a crushing gravity. The two who had barked, mocked, and threatened now trembled in the face of a truth they couldn't escape. On Anthony's face, fury and authority merged into one, turning him into a living symbol of resistance and justice. And in that moment, the confrontation no longer belonged to the ones holding the guns. It had shifted fully to the man who once stood alone in the rain, now rising like a pillar in the heart of the storm. Across the street, from the second-floor window of a small house, light spilled through a narrow gap in the curtain. Inside the dark room, a thin teenage girl held a phone in trembling hands, her palms slick with sweat, the screen nearly slipping from her grip as she tightened her hold. Her name was Emily, 17 years old, eyes wide, breath quick, her entire body tense like a wire pulled to the edge of snapping. From that spot, the phone's camera lens pointed straight at the gate of Anthony Cole's mansion, where flashing red and blue patrol lights lit up the scene. Two officers aiming their guns at a man standing tall, holding up a gleaming FBI badge. She knew exactly what she was recording, but her heart pounded, throat dry, afraid even the smallest sound might alert the men below. Emily leaned slightly, inhaling slowly, her finger holding the record button as each second passed and became living evidence. Rain pounded the glass in steady thuds, while the shouts of Halper and Miller rang out clearly. Every insult, every threat, every shove and strike, all of it was captured on screen. Most crucially, the black gun barrel pointed squarely at the chest of a man who had just identified himself as the director of the FBI. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine, knowing this wasn't something people saw in everyday life. This was the kind of moment where a single misstep could turn into tragedy. The small phone trembled in her hand, the screen's glow reflecting off her pale, young face. Emily looked down, seeing Anthony standing firm, his eyes like molten steel, while the officers kept shouting filth, ignoring the truth laid bare before them. She whispered, as if to herself, "Oh God, they're going to shoot him." A shiver raced down her back, but that same fear made her bite her lip harder, refusing to stop. Her grip tightened around the phone, eyes locked on the screen, determined to record every second. A door behind her creaked open, and her mother peeked in, face lined with worry. She started toward her to grab the phone, but Emily pleaded with a glance, shaking her head, whispering with a trembling voice, "Mom, I have to do this. The world needs to see." Her mother froze, shaking, then slowly backed away and closed the door softly. Emily turned back, eyes locked on the scene outside. Down below, Halper roared, Miller echoed, and the whole thing became a piercing symphony of humiliation and abuse of power. On screen, Anthony stood tall in the rain, the FBI badge glowing in his hand like the final line against madness. Emily felt her chest ready to burst, her hands shaking so much the footage quivered, and she fought to steady it, whispering between frantic breaths, "I have to show the world this." She looked at the screen and saw Anthony's eyes filled with a terrifying determination. That image cut straight into her chest, giving her strength. Emily knew that if she didn't act, everything would vanish into silence, like the thousands of other incidents no one ever named. She took a deep breath, and her trembling finger slid across the screen, opening the social media app. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint, but the fierce look in Anthony's eyes kept her grounded, pushing her to take the final step. The rain still roared outside, the guns still pointed, insults still dropped heavy into the night, and in the dark room, only the soft blue light of the screen remained. Emily hit the upload button. The faint click rang out softly, but to her it sounded heavier than anything, like a blade cutting through fear, opening a path forward. The video began to upload. The progress bar moved, each second dragging like a century. Emily pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath. Then the words, "Upload completed," appeared on the screen. In that moment, She knew the stone had rolled off the cliff, an avalanche had begun, and the whole world would soon witness what those two officers thought could be buried forever in the rain and dark. Emily lowered the phone into her lap, her hands still shaking, eyes wet with tears. She didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. Silence had been broken from this small room, from the trembling hands of a 17-year-old girl. The truth had been released, slipping past every wall, every fear, spreading through the digital world like fire bursting through a frozen night. And that fire would burn down the arrogance of the men standing in the rain, their guns still raised, but their souls already trembling, about to be stripped bare by the light of justice. In the dark room, where Emily had just trembled while hitting upload, her phone began to vibrate nonstop only minutes later. Notifications flooded in, the first shares appeared, then multiplied rapidly like fire sweeping through dry woods. Outside, the rain still poured heavily, but in the digital space, a far more violent storm was taking shape. Words lit up the glowing screen. The first hashtag flooding the timeline, #, justice for Anthony Cole. Moments later, another dropped like a hammer blow, #racist cops. Both phrases shot up the trending charts, pulling with them thousands of furious comments. A viral tweet spread at breakneck speed, paired with the video Emily had just posted. If this can happen to the director of the FBI, what chance do the rest of us have? A short question, but it hit like a wake-up call, leaving a lump in the throat of everyone reading. Within half an hour, hundreds of thousands of shares exploded, and soon millions. People everywhere, from major cities to rural corners, replayed the video, going silent as they watched two officers point guns at Anthony and shout orders to kneel like punishing a lowly criminal. 2 hours later, views had surpassed 1 million. Every click poured more fuel onto the fire of outrage spreading across social media. Comments flooded in by the second, anger erupting without pause. One person wrote, "I've watched it again and again, and still can't believe they pointed guns at the actual director of the FBI." Another wrote, "How many times have we talked about police reform? This is living proof. They're not changing. They're getting worse." Emotions spiraled like a rising flood, unstoppable and fierce. YouTube, TikTok, and other platforms quickly joined the fray. Analysis videos surfaced, frame-by-frame breakdowns zoomed in and slowed down the moment Halper screamed in Anthony's face, "On your knees." That shout echoed through the internet, making viewers shudder each time they replayed it. Some channels clipped only that moment, looping it until the humiliation hit like a slap again and again against the pride of an entire community. The comments under these videos overflowed with fury. "We don't kneel, and no one has the right to make us kneel in our own homes." Social media didn't just spread outrage, it became a full-blown movement. Political cartoons and mocking memes targeting the two officers began to appear. One illustration was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Two trembling officers in the rain, facing a man standing tall with a shining FBI badge above the words, "Justice doesn't kneel." Screenshots of Anthony holding up his badge were printed, captioned with slogans of resistance, and overnight they became symbols across the internet. Online discussions erupted across private and public groups in every forum. A college student wrote, "I think of my dad, just an ordinary man. If he were stopped by police right at his doorstep, would he even get a chance to speak?" A middle-aged woman commented, "We pay taxes for protection, but our taxes are feeding the guns pointed at us." That wave of anger spread fast, connecting strangers through one common thread: the fear of becoming a target simply because of skin color. Meanwhile, social activists moved quickly to seize the moment. They called for people to take to the the streets, organized small protests in multiple cities, lit candles outside police stations, holding up signs with slogans born straight from social media. The hashtag #Justice for Anthony Cole became a rallying flag, and the phrase, "If this can happen to the director of the FBI, what about the rest of us?" turned into a relentless chant. Online news outlets quickly joined in, live streaming the video being replayed thousands of times. Anchors struggled to speak clearly, one saying through a tight throat, "Tonight is historic. Social media has become the witness for justice. There's nothing left to hide." Those words echoed far, turning digital outrage into growing real-world pressure. In her small room, Emily still held her phone tightly, watching the numbers climb, eyes wet with tears. She never imagined that short clip would ignite a movement. Each new notification lit up the screen. New hashtags appeared, and comments flooded in like a storm. She knew that from this moment forward, the story no longer belonged to her. It had become the voice of millions. That social media storm could no longer be stopped. It swept away silence, shattered every wall of denial, and turned a moment of public humiliation in the rain into a blazing torch in the public consciousness. And somewhere out there, the two police officers still had no idea that while they stood trembling before an FBI badge, their careers and their lives had already been decided by the internet in just a few short hours. In just one night, the video Emily recorded broke beyond the borders of popular social media platforms. Major newsrooms across the United States picked it up, from traditional print outlets to top online sites, with headlines splashed across front pages. FBI director held at gunpoint by local police outside his own home. Alongside it was a still from the video. Anthony Cole standing tall in the rain, FBI badge held high, facing two drawn guns. The drama of that moment made every outlet rush to publish, not just as a news item, but as a cultural earthquake. Within hours, the story had spread beyond the U.S., reaching the UK, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and many other nations. International media ran it across time zones, raising questions about the American police system and the racism that refuses to die. In Washington, reporters packed the White House press room. The government spokesperson stepped up to the podium, but before saying a word, a flurry of questions hit the room. Is the White House aware that the FBI director was threatened at gunpoint by local police? What is the president's position on this incident? Does this prove that police reform is failing? Microphones shot up, lenses zoomed in, and the clicking of shutters was non-stop. The spokesperson, visibly tense, answered slowly, "We are aware of the incident and are working closely with the Department of Justice on a full investigation. The president considers this a serious matter." But the answer didn't ease the outrage. It only fueled the press to push harder, demanding action now, not promises later. Politicians quickly entered the fray. A black senator stood on the floor of Congress, his voice ringing live on national television. If even the director of the FBI can have guns pointed at him outside his own home, how many more innocent citizens must suffer? Police reform cannot wait another day. Thunderous applause followed, with other lawmakers rising in support. A young congresswoman spoke out on social media. Her post shared millions of times. This is not an isolated incident. It's an indictment of the entire system. If we stay silent, history will judge us. Meanwhile, the image of Anthony Cole holding up his FBI badge became a symbol. Television played the moment over and over. His arm raised, the badge catching the light, his steady eyes unshaken. That image made the covers of magazines, appeared on protest posters, and became a new icon in America's fight against racial injustice. People plastered it on city walls, printed it on T-shirts, hung it from banners everywhere, alongside slogans like "Justice Justice Doesn't Kneel and Justice for Anthony. Online discussions grew hotter by the hour. Television networks brought in legal experts, former police officers, and sociologists to analyze every detail. A political analyst said, "That moment struck a collective nerve because it revealed a harsh truth. Even those in the highest positions of power are not immune to discrimination." A former police chief admitted, "We have to face reality. The uniform has been abused, and every act of misconduct kills public trust." On late-night talk shows, the image of Anthony was replayed over and over. Hosts emphasized, "This is not just a confrontation. This is a message that America needs to take a hard look at its own system." The studio audience fell silent, then rose together in applause as the screen zoomed in on Anthony's eyes, steady in the rain. At the same time, political pressure mounted. Human rights organizations submitted urgent petitions to Congress, demanding the passage of independent oversight laws for police. Protests began forming outside local government buildings, people carrying candles, holding up the image of Anthony, raising his badge, and chanting his name. Some religious leaders joined as well, offering prayers for justice, turning these gatherings into sacred and unified moments. On the international front, foreign media covered the story extensively. A European headline read, "America's Nightmare. Not even the FBI director is safe from police guns." In Asia, news programs framed the event as a warning of a crisis of trust in the world's largest democracy. Scholars remarked that this incident would not be a passing shock, but a historical marker, a lasting reminder of the urgent need to restructure the entire law enforcement system. All of America shook in a media storm. What began on a rainy night at the gates of a mansion had now become the center of the world's attention, and at the eye of that storm, the image of Anthony Cole holding up his FBI badge in the rain had moved beyond the man himself. It had become a collective symbol of the belief that justice cannot be silenced. Before the media storm had a chance to settle, online communities began digging into the pasts of officers Roy Halper and Miller Grant. Within a single day, old disciplinary records surfaced, and reports once buried in internal documents were now shared everywhere, becoming proof that this wasn't a momentary mistake but a long-standing pattern of behavior. Articles listed past complaints against Halper for excessive force against black citizens, from dragging a teenager outside a supermarket to forcing a driver to lie face down in the street simply for being black and driving an expensive car. Though these complaints surfaced year after year, most ended with conclusions like insufficient evidence or no procedural violation. Now, with the truth laid bare, those details reemerged as puzzle pieces revealing the portrait of an abuser embedded within the system. Miller Grant wasn't spared. The internet unearthed blurry videos showing him laughing during random stops of black residents in suburban neighborhoods. One witness had previously reported that Miller pointed a gun at her 15-year-old brother's head during an unprovoked ID check. All of it, buried for years, was now being dug up and spread at lightning speed. Posts carrying the hashtag Justice for Anthony Cole now came with a new one, History of Abuse, underscoring that this was not an isolated incident, but the continuation of a familiar pattern. People began to question why such records had never led to serious consequences, and why officers with tainted histories were still patrolling the streets armed. Television news quickly capitalized on these revelations. Some networks aired compilations of Halper and Grant's prior incidents, interviewing families who had filed complaints only to be ignored. One mother, eyes wet, recounted the night her son was pinned to the ground while police laughed. The report, later filed as legal detainment and forgotten. An elderly man shakily held up old paperwork, proof that Halper had once kicked in his door without a warrant. These voices, long buried in silence, now surged together into a wave that added fresh weight to the public's growing fury. International media joined in, portraying Halper and Grant as symbols of systemic abuse. European outlets ran headlines headlines highlighting how, when systems protect the guilty, disaster is inevitable. An Asian news channel aired a 30-minute segment outlining the profiles of both officers through a string of past offenses, helping foreign audiences see that what happened to Anthony Cole was not an accident. It was the product of a deeply broken structure. On social media, users continuously created charts and timelines listing every incident connected to Halper and Grant. Each timestamp stood as proof of repetition, from rifle butt beatings, racial slurs, to threatening to shoot civilians simply for being uncooperative. These data maps were shared widely, turning the names Halper and Grant into symbols of everything the public resented about law enforcement. In discussion panels, experts emphasized that no organization should be allowed to repeat the same mistakes with the same individuals without consequence. Human rights activists stressed this was clear evidence that the complaint system was a facade, and complicity had become the norm. They said that if not for the fateful video of Anthony Cole, Halper and Grant would still be out on the streets, guns in hand, eyes filled with contempt, and countless more innocent people would continue to suffer. The anger spread, followed by widespread shame cast over the local police department. Commanders were called out by name on national television, demanded to explain why 2 officers had been allowed to abuse their power for so long. The cover-up was exposed, and the political pressure intensified by the hour. In the eyes of the public, this was no longer just about one man being mistreated. It was the unmasking of an entire system, one where armed men believed they stood above the law. And now, that illusion had been shattered, leaving the world stunned by the level of corruption that had remained hidden for so long. Roy Halper's home became a media hotspot overnight. Outside his gate, dozens of reporters set up cameras, microphones raised, flashes popping non-stop. His wife tried to step out, face pale, holding a small child, but was immediately met with a storm of questions. What do you think of the accusations against your husband? Were you aware of his disciplinary record? How will your family respond to this public backlash? She said nothing, clutching the child, and turned back inside, leaving behind the hum of cameras and relentless noise. A similar scene unfolded at Miller Grant's house, where his elderly parents stood stunned by the media presence. His father, voice shaking, said, "He's my son, but I can't defend what he's done." That admission was captured and broadcast across news channels, shared as confirmation from his own family of the accusations now flooding the headlines. Meanwhile, public outrage did not subside. Instead, it surged even more fiercely. Community groups continuously called for the immediate suspension of both Halper and Grant, not just through social media posts, but with formal petitions submitted to government authorities. Within 2 days, millions of signatures were gathered, turning the demand into an undeniable pressure. Small marches began to appear, with people carrying images of Anthony Cole holding up his FBI badge alongside justice slogans, chanting the names of the 2 officers as a public indictment. The media described the event as a wave crashing through all barriers. Not a single news program ignored it, not one panel discussion failed to mention it. Footage of Halper and Grant's families, overwhelmed by the camera, was played repeatedly, illustrating the price paid when truth is buried for too long. The commentary on television only added fuel to the fire. If they aren't suspended immediately, how can the public trust this system again? That question echoed everywhere, repeated endlessly, becoming a relentless call to action. In this atmosphere, the local police department was forced to hold an emergency press conference. The spokesperson tried to maintain composure, but under the angry stares of hundreds in attendance, his words rang hollow. "We are conducting a review," he said, but the crowd immediately erupted, chanting for immediate suspension. Those chants, blended with online slogans, with millions of tweets and posts, forming a tidal wave of pressure. And, in the midst of this storm, Halper and Grant were no longer just 2 individual names, but symbols of systemic corruption that society now unanimously demanded be punished without leniency. On Tuesday morning, While the press still swarmed outside the homes of Halper and Grant, the FBI headquarters in Washington unexpectedly released an official statement. The brief document carried enough weight to strike like lightning through an already tense atmosphere. The man, held at gunpoint by police in the viral video, is Director Anthony Cole. No evasive language, no hedging. The FBI confirmed the identity of its highest-ranking official to the public, affirming that he had been humiliated and threatened at his own front gate by 2 local officers. The statement was broadcast across every media outlet, bolded in print, turning rumor into an undeniable fact. The public's reaction was immediate and explosive. Millions, already outraged, were now stunned, as many had assumed the video captured a mistaken identity or an incident targeting an ordinary black civilian. With Anthony's identity confirmed, the horror deepened. Social media was filled with shocked comments. "Dear God, that's really the director of the FBI?" One user wrote, "If someone at that level can still be targeted by abuse of power, what hope is there for the rest of us?" Widespread unease turned into unprecedented fury. TV broadcasts cut into regular programming to replay the video alongside the official statement. Anchors, faces tense, read each word slowly, voices catching on the final line. This is the first time in history that an FBI director has been threatened by local police at his private residence. The image of Anthony holding up his badge, its reflective glare unmistakable, replayed on loop as irrefutable proof. The nation reeled. On the streets, people gathered in small clusters, whispering anxiously, faces filled with concern. Coffee shops played the footage on large screens, customers holding their breath. Phrases like abuse of power, crisis of trust, and urgent reform became commonplace in every conversation. A middle-aged man, a war veteran, when asked by a reporter, responded bluntly, "I've seen injustice before, but I never imagined this. This is an insult to all of us." Civil society organizations quickly spoke out, from bar associations to human rights groups. They issued statements declaring this incident no longer an isolated case, but something far beyond an internal investigation. "This is evidence of a full-scale crisis in the justice system," one group declared. "If an FBI director isn't safe, then no one is." From another perspective, many politicians were unexpectedly forced to change their stance. Some, who had previously avoided comment, now had no choice but to speak publicly. They appeared on television, admitting this was a major stain and calling for an independent committee to investigate. One senator stated bluntly, "We've gone too far in enabling abuse of power. The case of Anthony Cole is the final warning. If we don't reform, we will lose the trust of the entire nation." Amid these reactions, the image of Anthony Cole began to transcend the individual. He was no longer just a security leader, but a symbol of resistance, of the pride of a community long suppressed. Protest signs bore the words, "We are Anthony Cole." People wore shirts with his image, fists raised high, demanding justice. The FBI's confirmation, though only an administrative document, had ignited a fire, fueling a justice storm sweeping across the country. By nightfall, major cities lit up with waves of marchers, candles burned in their hands, and determination lit their faces. Chants of "Justice for Anthony" echoed through the streets, bouncing off the glass walls of skyscrapers in a thunderous chorus. The event, already seismic at home, drew the attention of the global community, raising the question, if the United States allows even its FBI director to become a victim of abuse, what standard can the rest of the world rely on? And among the voices shouting in unison, everyone understood that the FBI's brief confirmation had changed everything. It tore apart the veil of excuses, dragged the truth into the light, and forced an entire nation to stop looking away. From that moment, The story was no longer just about Anthony Cole being insulted, it had become the symbol of a fight against corruption, and no force could stop the wave that had been unleashed. Anthony Cole returned to FBI headquarters the next morning amid a crowd of cameras. The main gate was packed with reporters, each wanting to capture his first steps after a night that had shaken the nation. When his car pulled up, Anthony stepped out in a dark suit, face expressionless, gaze unwavering, without a single nod to acknowledge the crowd. He walked past a sea of questions, ignoring the microphones pointed at him, unfazed by dozens of voices calling his name. His posture steady, stride firm, he entered the building as a silent message to the world. The truth had not shaken him. In the office, on the upper floor, where glass windows looked directly onto the square below, the morning light cut a sharp line across the desk. Anthony stood before it, laying down his FBI badge on the wooden surface, his hand still showing faint swelling from the confrontation the night before. He scanned the room, his eyes glowing with resolve. Assistants and junior agents stepped in, their faces solemn, none daring to speak, offering only respectful nods. No speech was needed. Anthony's cold, commanding presence made it clear he would turn humiliation into fuel for an unprecedented reform. The media outside quickly seized on that image. Photos of Anthony in the conference room, expression unchanging, flooded newspapers, accompanied by bold headlines like "The Director Who Stood Tall" and "A Steady Face in the Storm." His image became a new symbol of defiance, not only representing the agency he led, but also serving as a reminder that any citizen, regardless of power, could be targeted by prejudice, and that justice must be defended to the end. Within days, the incident had gone far beyond a security breach. It became a national symbol, featured in speeches by politicians, in family conversations, and in civics classrooms. The image of Anthony Cole, with his composed face and unwavering gaze, etched itself into the minds of millions, becoming an emblem of outrage and the hunger for change. Ordinary citizens carried his portrait in marches, hung posters of him outside police stations, and saw him asaner around which to rally for justice. From a dark, rainy night, Anthony's story had become a spiritual anchor for an entire nation, marking the start of a time when truth and justice could no longer be buried. After the FBI officially confirmed the truth, public pressure mounted on the Department of Justice like a massive boulder. Within 48 hours, the Attorney General signed an order to form a special investigative team, gathering the best prosecutors and senior federal inspectors. The directive was clear and uncompromising: no tolerance, no concessions, no cover-ups. This team was granted full authority to examine every aspect of the incident, from the moment Halper and Grant appeared at Anthony Cole's gate to when the video went viral worldwide. Access to records, power to summon witnesses, even the ability to request support from other agencies was granted immediately, to prove that the legal system this time must face itself. As the Special Investigative Unit began its work, even more explosive news erupted. Media outlets simultaneously reported that Halper and Grant had been disarmed and handcuffed at the very precinct where they served. Broadcast live to millions of viewers, the footage showed the two men in sweat-soaked uniforms, hands tightly restrained behind their backs, being led out the door like criminals. No more shouting, no more arrogance in their eyes, only lowered faces and heavy steps amid the furious chants of the crowd gathered outside. Many people wept as they watched, seeing it as a historic moment. The first time the arrogance of a force long seen as above the law was dragged down to the ground. Inside the precinct, Halper and Grant's colleagues stood in stunned silence. Some averted their eyes in shame, some stared with anger, feeling betrayed, and others let out heavy sighs, as if they all knew this was the inevitable result of years of unchecked abuse. A young officer whispered to a colleague, "We should have stopped this long ago." That short sentence echoed like a late confession, admitting that silent complicity had helped push the two men over the edge. The scene of Halper and Grant being escorted out quickly spread across social media, igniting another wave of outrage and grim satisfaction. People shared the image with captions like, "Now, this is justice." Videos showed the crowd yelling, some shouting, "You should have put the guns down long ago, now bow your heads." Countless comments appeared. "They've trampled others for years, now they finally pay." The internet boiled with emotion, as if millions were witnessing together a door to justice being flung open. Meanwhile, the special investigative team began collecting the first pieces of evidence. They reviewed the original video from Emily, extracted data from the patrol car's dash cam, and combed through years of service records for Halper and Grant. Every document, every line in the old disciplinary files has now become a link in constructing a full picture. A prosecutor told the press, "We will not stop at this recent event. We will trace back every violation that was covered up." That statement rang out as a pledge that the investigation would not end with two individuals, but could sweep through an entire web of complicity behind them. Tension across the country was palpable. People followed every bit of news, every detail of the investigation. Live broadcasts repeatedly showed Halper and Grant in custody, their pale faces behind bars, a bitter contrast to the image of them arrogantly pointing guns at Anthony Cole. To the public, this had become a stark reminder that power, when unchecked, becomes a weapon. And now that the weapon had been taken away, everyone was waiting to see if justice would be strong enough to turn this moment into a historic turning point. Major television networks interrupted regular programming to air special reports. Bold letters scrolled across the screen. "Police under federal investigation," repeating continuously in the lower corner. Reporters stood in front of the Department of Justice, the national flag flapping behind them, speaking solemnly. "A federal investigative team has been formed. Every action of officers Roy Halper and Miller Grant is now under direct review by the Department of Justice." That statement rang out, confirming to the entire nation that this was no longer a matter for a local police department, but was now in the hands of the highest legal authority. Footage of the officers being handcuffed and escorted out of the precinct was replayed frame by frame, fueling public outrage while also giving a sense that justice was finally making its way back. In many homes, viewers watched intently. Some wept as they watched, others clenched their fists as if years of suppressed emotion were finally being released. A group of college students in their dorm recorded a reaction video shouting, "Justice for Anthony," as the phrase "police under federal investigation" appeared on their TV. That clip quickly spread, adding fuel to public sentiment. Elderly people who had lived through generations of injustice shook their heads, but in their eyes was a rare spark of hope. Maybe this time would be different, because the truth had been exposed too clearly to deny. While television broadcasts continued non-stop outside the city hall of the town where Anthony lived, hundreds of citizens had gathered early. They brought banners, printed photos of Anthony holding up his FBI badge in the rainy night, along with handwritten signs that read, "Justice cannot wait." The atmosphere was electric, with drums and cheers echoing off the old stone walls, turning the once quiet area into a square of freedom. When the news banner, "Police under federal investigation," appeared live on the large screen set in the middle of the square, the entire crowd erupted into applause, then roared with cheers. The chant, "Anthony Cole," thundered in rhythm, blending with car horns and clapping, forming a fiery chorus. A young woman holding a baby raised a sign that read, "Our future needs protection," her voice choking with emotion. A group of laborers had driven in from the suburbs, singing a justice anthem together at the steps of City Hall. Young people live-streamed the scene, broadcasting it to the world, so international friends could see. This was no longer the story of one city, but the collective roar of a nation. In response to the noise, windows on the upper floors of City Hall cracked open, a few officials peering out, but none daring to step outside. The The crowd chanted louder, sending a clear message that they would not back down. Images of people cheering into the night, candles glowing in long rows, fire-lit faces, and eyes full of resolve quickly appeared in international news. Major outlets described it as a citizen eruption, a moment when those who once stayed silent rose together, forcing the system to bow before the truth. And through it all, the name Anthony Cole echoed as a symbol of justice, chanted like a promise that this time the fight would not be abandoned halfway. The federal courthouse was packed from early morning, with long lines of people waiting at the gates, every face tense with anticipation. When the courtroom doors opened, the air grew thick with camera shutters clicking and constant murmurs. On the defendant's bench, Roy Halper and Miller Grant appeared in orange prison uniforms, their wrists still bearing marks from the cuffs. Gone was the aggression they displayed that rainy night at the mansion gate. Both kept their heads down, avoiding the public's gaze. Whispers broke out, followed by a few jeers from the gallery. "This is justice. Look at them now. The men who once held guns can only bow their heads." The scene was broadcast live, watched by millions across the country and beyond, turning the hearing into a national event. As the trial began, the federal prosecutor stepped up to the podium, holding a thick file, his voice resonating in the pin-drop silence of the room. He read aloud the charges, each word crystal clear. Roy Halper and Miller Grant are charged with abuse of power while on duty, engaging in severe racial discrimination, and threatening the life of a citizen at his place of residence. Each count landed like a hammer blow, making the two defendants lower their heads further, lip pressed tight, fists clenched in helplessness. In the gallery, some people cried, others gripped each other's hands, the mention of justice electrifying the room. The prosecutor didn't stop at the indictment. He went on to detail the defendant's actions, pointing to the large screen behind him, which replayed the original video. Halper aimed his gun, the shout, "On your knees," ringing loud and clear, followed by Grant's smug support, then Anthony Cole raising his FBI badge under the rain. Everything appeared uncut, undeniable. The prosecutor emphasized this moment revealed the truth, not just about the two defendants, but about a rot that's lived inside the system. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was years of contempt for the law. Applause broke out from the gallery, though the judge quickly struck the gavel for order. The emotion in the room was impossible to suppress. Halper briefly looked up, his eyes vacant, then quickly turned away, avoiding the gaze of Anthony Cole seated in the witness section. Grant kept biting his lip, his face pale, sweat beading, eyes darting as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. Their silence stood in stark contrast to their arrogance in the rain, fueling public outrage further. On social media, millions watching the live stream posted comments, many writing, "This is who they really are. Not the ones barking orders, but cowards under the light of truth." The trial stretched through the entire morning, filled with the prosecutor's sharp arguments, visual evidence, and witness testimonies. Every detail presented hammered another nail into the truth, building a clear picture of abuse of power. When the charges were fully read, the judge looked directly at the two defendants, his voice cold. "This court will not tolerate any excuse. You allowed your weapons and authority to become tools of humiliation against a citizen, and that action will be judged openly, without concealment." That firm statement was quoted across headlines shortly after, a declaration that justice was finally returning to its rightful place. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of thousands watching the hearing on a large screen erupted in cheers. Flags were raised high, chants of "Justice for Anthony" echoed across the square, blending with distant church bells. For them, this first trial was not just a legal proceeding, but a door opening to hope that, after so many years of enduring, justice was finally beginning to be rewritten. Halper and Grant's defense attorney stepped to the podium with a thick stack of documents, his face trying to remain composed, though his voice betrayed the tension. He began with familiar phrases. "My clients acted under pressure. This was a proceeding procedural error, a misunderstanding in the line of duty. His words echoed through the courtroom, trying to frame the defendants as officers simply caught off guard while performing their duties. He cited the law regarding officers' right to self-defense, arguing that drawing their weapons or ordering someone to kneel was an instinctive reaction to a potentially dangerous situation. The lawyer emphasized that there was no intent to target Anthony Cole personally, only a misidentification, but the courtroom seemed unwilling to accept it. In the gallery, heads shook vigorously, murmurs rose, some scoffed bitterly, seeing the argument as an insult to the public's intelligence. As the lawyer repeated the phrase procedural error, the judge's expression flickered with irritation. The footage on the screen remained, unedited and undeniable, showing racial humiliation, direct threats to a man's life, all captured clearly and unmistakably. The prosecutor rose, his voice sharpened. If this is procedure, then we are discussing a brutal procedure, one that violates human rights. If this was a mistake, then it is a mistake repeated across dozens of past records. We can no longer cover this up with hollow words. This is the truth, not a technicality. His pointed rebuttal sparked applause across the room, forcing the judge to strike the gavel and call for order. Anthony Cole sat in the witness stand, his face cold, eyes fixed on the testimony podium. He said nothing, but his presence alone was enough to dismantle every excuse. The judge looked at the two defendants, then turned back to the lawyer, his voice deep and firm. This court does not exist to legitimize human rights violations. There is no such thing as a procedural error when a citizen is humiliated and threatened at their own doorstep. The evidence is overwhelming. All charges remain unchanged. The courtroom swelled with energy, applause erupting throughout, and this time the judge didn't stop it, because that agreement was the voice of justice itself. Halper and Grant kept their heads down, unable to look up. Their lawyer closed the file and stepped back with heavy steps, knowing every path of defense had been shut. The verdict had yet to be announced, but the outcome was already clear. The truth was no longer distorted, and justice had been put back in its rightful place. Outside the courthouse, thousands waited for news. When reporters announced that the court had rejected the procedural error argument and upheld the charges, the crowd exploded in cheers, flags, and banners waving in the wind. Chants of "Justice for Anthony" echoed. Songs and drums blended with the tears of those who had waited so long for this moment. In that instant, the public knew they were not just witnessing the fall of two officers, but a turning point in the system itself. The courtroom lights dimmed as the prosecutor signaled the technician to play the original video. The large screen behind the judge lit up, familiar frames appearing one by one. Halper shouting, his gun pointed straight at Anthony Cole. Miller's sneering laugh, rain pouring over the awning. Then, the moment Anthony raised his FBI badge, the light catching his face, cold and commanding. The room fell completely silent, the sound of rain from the video echoing eerily, making the atmosphere suffocating. A few spectators covered their mouths, and others shook their heads in disbelief, unable to grasp how this could happen to any citizen, let alone the director of the FBI. As the video paused on the frame where the gun remained pointed, the prosecutor turned to the witness stand, his voice steady. "Emily Sanders, please take the stand." Every eye turned to the young girl who had bravely held up her phone that rainy night to capture the truth. Emily wore a simple shirt, her hair tied back, her face pale but eyes unwavering. Her steps trembled slightly, but she did not retreat. Her hands clenched tightly to steady herself. Standing before the court, her voice at first shook. "I live right across from Mr. Cole's house. That night I heard shouting, so I ran to the window." She took a deep breath and continued, this time more firmly. "I saw them point their guns at him, insult him, use racial slurs, and I knew I had to do something. I was scared, but I thought if no one dared to record it, there would never be justice. So I grabbed my phone and filmed everything." A murmur of admiration swept through the courtroom, and a few eyes welled with tears. Anthony Cole seated below, bowed his head slightly, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. The defense lawyer stood, attempting to challenge her. "Are you certain the lighting and sound in the video accurately reflect the events? Could you have misinterpreted the situation?" Emily gripped the microphone, her voice suddenly resolute. "No, I did not misinterpret. I saw it with my own eyes. I heard every word they said. I saw how they looked at Mr. Cole like he was a criminal on his own doorstep. If I had let fear silence me, maybe no one would know what happened today." That statement struck the courtroom like a hammer, shattering any remaining pretense. The judge listened attentively, then nodded, officially acknowledging the testimony. The prosecutor stepped closer to Emily, his voice gentle. "Do you realize what your actions that night have changed?" The young girl looked straight ahead, her eyes bright. "I didn't think much at the time. I just wanted to do the right thing. But now I know the truth is more powerful than any lie." The entire courtroom erupted in prolonged applause, no one able to hold back their emotion. That day's trial marked a turning point, as the appearance of the witness not only provided vivid evidence, but also affirmed that even in darkness, ordinary people still dare to stand up. Emily, an unknown young girl, became the voice of a community, affirming that justice does not belong to a select few, but to all who dare to defend it. And in that moment, her trembling yet resolute image before the court gave strength to an entire society, a reminder that truth can never be extinguished as long as someone dares to bring it into the light. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. No shout was distorted. "This is the truth." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, then pointed directly at the screen frozen on the frame of Halper yelling, his gun aimed at Anthony Cole's chest. These sounds weren't edited. Every word of "on your knees" is living proof of how power can be turned into a weapon of oppression. What you're hearing isn't a procedural command. You're hearing a command soaked in contempt and prejudice. This is no case of mistaken identity. This is deliberate humiliation. His sharp words sliced through the air like a blade, leaving behind a heavy silence that made everyone in the courtroom straighten in their seats, hearts pounding faster. The prosecutor continued, his voice growing stronger. "A police officer has the right to protect, not to humiliate. A police officer has the right to ask for cooperation, not to scream like a tyrant. This image, this sound, all of it exposes the truth that citizens of this country can be treated like criminals on their own doorstep just because of the color of their skin." He paused again, lowering his voice, yet the tension only deepened. "You may choose to look away, but video doesn't lie. This is the truth." The courtroom was utterly silent, so still that the soft tapping of the judge's pen on the desk was clearly heard. The spectators remained motionless. No one dared to speak. Even breaths seemed held back. Every eye was fixed on the two defendants, where Halper and Grant sat frozen, faces pale, hands clenched into fists, but neither said a word in defense. Even their lawyer bowed his head, the folder in his hands trembling slightly, as if he knew every excuse had collapsed. In that moment, the silence became an unspoken verdict. It did not come from the judge's gavel or any formal declaration, but from the hundreds of people witnessing a truth too undeniable to ignore. A woman in the gallery covered her face, tears falling, not from sorrow, but from relief that someone had finally spoken for the millions who never could, that justice could not be twisted. A middle-aged man squeezed his son's hand tightly and whispered through clenched teeth, "Remember this moment, son. This is when justice spoke." The judge sat upright, his gaze cold as he looked around the courtroom, then turned back to the two defendants. He didn't need to say another word, because the atmosphere had already spoken for itself. No one objected, no one scoffed. There was none of the usual noise heard in high-profile trials, only a thick silence, like a wall pressing down on Halper and Grant, drowning them in an inescapable humiliation. Outside the courthouse, The crowd watching the live feed on the giant screen also fell silent for several seconds. Their eyes were locked on the image of the prosecutor standing before the video screen, hand raised, declaring, "This is the truth." No one spoke, no chants were shouted. The entire square seemed to hold its breath, and then that silence spread even farther, becoming a moment of unity across a nation, that the truth had been revealed, leaving no room for lies or excuses. In that moment, both inside the courtroom and on the streets outside, silence became the most powerful language. It echoed louder than any accusation, carried more weight than any legal argument, and marked the final end of years of unchecked abuse. After the first explosive days of the trial, the Special Investigation Team began its work with urgency. Documents were unlocked, every old report, every memo buried in long-forgotten file cabinets brought into the light. Within weeks, a bleak picture emerged. Numerous complaints from citizens filed with the police department had been suppressed, many reports were redacted, and witness statements mysteriously vanished. Red-inked notes reading "handled internally" appeared frequently, yet no actual disciplinary action had ever taken place. Every time Halper or Grant's name appeared in a complaint, the file was quickly closed with vague reasons like insufficient evidence. The interim investigative report revealed this was no longer about two rogue individuals, but an entire system complicit in silence. Senior officers had ignored warnings, civilian oversight committees had been rendered powerless, and even a few local prosecutors were found to have close ties, often dismissing evidence against the two officers. As each layer of concealment was peeled back, the public realized they had been living within a system where justice wasn't determined by law, but by relationships and cover-ups. Media outlets reported in unison, calling it the network of silence, where fear and personal interests bound those who were supposed to protect what was right. One major newspaper ran the headline, "When the System Becomes a Shield for Abusers." Public outrage reached a fever pitch as the story expanded beyond two officers to expose an entire chain of power. A wave of local politicians was forced to issue explanations, with emergency meetings held one after another, giving the impression of a massive wall once thought unshakable, now cracking apart. Among the unearthed documents were handwritten letters that sent chills down readers' spines. One mother had reported Halper for pointing a gun at her teenage son just because he wore a hoodie late at night. An elderly man recounted how Miller slammed his hand on his car hood during a random stop, accompanied by racial slurs. All those cries for help had once been ignored, only to build up into the explosion that followed the Anthony Cole video. The public's anger deepened with the realization that if any of those letters had been properly addressed, things might never have escalated this far. The Special Investigation Team concluded in its preliminary report that this was a systemic collapse of accountability and transparency. Those words echoed across the media, serving as clear proof that justice isn't halted by a lack of law, but by human hands deliberately bending it. The dry lines of the report shook society as they exposed the truth that injustice doesn't arise overnight, but is silently cultivated over the years. Tensions on the streets grew hotter, with marches expanding in both size and intensity. Protesters carried signs bearing not only the name Anthony Cole, but also the names of other overlooked victims. The calls were no longer just for punishing Halper and Grant, but for a complete purge of the system. Chants of "end the cover-up" rang through city squares, stressing that change must go beyond a single trial. Amid all this, images of Anthony Cole appeared less frequently, yet the weight of the story centered on him grew larger. He didn't need to say much, because each data point, each investigative document released, affirmed what he had once stated. Justice only exists when the truth is brought to light. And now that truth was no longer locked in filing cabinets, it stood exposed before an entire nation. Public scrutiny bore down heavily on officials who had once remained silent in the face of countless warnings. Emergency hearings were rushed into session, with senior police officials, local prosecutors, and even city administrators facing public questioning. Live broadcasts showed a police commissioner struggling to dodge a question, sweat on his brow, his voice cracking as he was asked, why were dozens of complaints involving Halper and Grant dismissed? The man had no answer, mumbling about lack of grounds, triggering a wave of angry outcries from the audience. Another official was grilled for signing off on a case closure in less than 24 hours, despite clear witnesses and evidence. The reports they had once signed now became indictments in themselves, transforming them from enforcers of power to defendants before the public. Emergency city council meetings descended into chaos. Citizens packed the chambers, raising signs demanding resignations, the air as heavy as in a courtroom. One opposition council member spoke sharply. "We cannot demand citizens obey the law when those entrusted to uphold it are the first to trample it." That statement was widely quoted and spread across social media like wildfire, fueling the protest movement. Meanwhile, politicians who had once dodged the issue were forced to issue apologies, but the delay did nothing to cool the rage that had been building for far too long. The political storm erupted in every sense of the word, as pressure no longer stopped at the city level, but spread to both the state and federal governments. The state governor was swarmed by reporters and forced to promise a complete overhaul of the police oversight system. The federal Congress convened an emergency session to discuss legal reforms regarding community control over law enforcement. Heated debates unfolded live on national television, where opposing factions clashed, but none could deny one fact: the current system had failed. International media also stepped in, framing the event as a major milestone in U.S. political history. A European newspaper ran the headline, "American Justice on the Brink," while Asian news outlets analyzed that this wasn't just a case of racial discrimination, but the beginning of a broader redefinition of the relationship between citizens and power. Editorials emphasized that the image of Anthony Cole was no longer just that of a victim, but a symbol of a reform movement the political system could no longer ignore. Each evening, thousands continued to gather in front of city halls, lighting candles that became a silent message aimed directly at those who once enabled the cover-ups. They chanted the names of victims who had been forgotten, rereading the buried complaints under the night sky, each name like an arrow aimed at the heart of the old system. Anger had grown beyond individual outrage, becoming a political whirlwind, sweeping away officials who once thought themselves safe behind silence. At the center of this storm stood one undeniable truth. For the first time in decades, political power was forced to bow to the voice of the people. This political upheaval didn't just shake the seats of authority. It opened a chance to rebuild the foundation of justice. And, in the minds of the public, what they demanded was not promises, but concrete action, so that years of cover-ups and silence would finally be buried in the past. On the day of the verdict, gray skies hung low over the city, but the square in front of the courthouse was lit brightly by thousands who had gathered since dawn. A heavy atmosphere weighed over the crowd, every gaze fixed on the heavy wooden doors leading into the courtroom. When the judge entered, the sound of the gavel struck like a fateful bell, echoing through the space. The sentence was read slowly, each word clear and sharp. Roy Halper is sentenced to 15 years in prison for abuse of power, systemic racial discrimination, and endangering a citizen's life. Miller Grant is sentenced to 12 years in prison on similar charges. Each number rang out like a thunderclap, silence in the room for a few seconds before the cheers outside erupted like a breaking wave. Halper lowered his head, shoulders trembling in despair, his eyes bloodshot, but stripped of all arrogance. Grant sat in a daze, mumbling something no one could make out, his face pale and lifeless. Both were escorted out of the courtroom under the angry stares of the public and the flash of media cameras. The image of two former officers, once brandishing weapons, now walking away in handcuffs, became a symbol of justice reversed, prompting viewers watching live on television to exhale in collective relief. But the verdict did not end there. The judge declared firmly, "The city's police chief is hereby removed from office for failure in oversight, allowing a prolonged culture of cover-up. The Civilian Oversight Committee will be reinstated under the independent authority of the Department of Justice." The announcement set off an explosion in the courtroom, people rising to their feet, clapping and cheering. Outside, the crowd erupted. Banners reading "Justice Served" waved high, and chants of "Anthony Cole" echoed down every street. News outlets quickly updated their headlines and live broadcasts, calling it a turning point for an entire era. One major newspaper wrote, "Today's verdict isn't just for two officers, it's for an entire system that once believed itself untouchable." Commentators on television noted that with the removal of the police chief, the message was unmistakable. No one, regardless of their position, can escape accountability for enabling abuse of power. In that moment, Anthony Cole remained composed. He sat quietly in the front row, his expression calm but thoughtful. He didn't cheer, didn't applaud, but simply watched as Halper and Grant were led away. To him, this wasn't a personal victory, but proof that the truth had finally been honored. That calm presence only deepened his symbolic strength, etched into the minds of millions watching live as an enduring image of justice. That afternoon, the square in front of the courthouse turned into a justice festival. People raised flags and sang loudly, children sat on their parents' shoulders, and many cried with relief after days of intense tension. Quick interviews all revolved around a common emotion, the satisfaction of seeing that justice was no longer an abstract concept, but something enacted right before their eyes. A middle-aged woman, teary-eyed, told a reporter, "I'm no longer afraid to walk outside because today I know that those who carry guns are no longer above the law." The sentences of 15 years and 12 years, along with the decision to dismiss the police chief, closed a dark chapter but also opened a new door. Society as a whole understood that this was not yet the end, but certainly a milestone, a point where truth and justice converged, forcing those who once abused power to bow before the voice of the people. As the verdict was announced, a shockwave spread through the local police department. The walls that once echoed with the stomp of boots now fell silent, and small groups of officers sat quietly in meeting rooms, their eyes heavy as if witnessing the collapse of an old order. They whispered among themselves, some lowering their heads in silence, others quietly flipping through their own personnel files to ensure they weren't tied to the buried cover-ups now being unearthed. A few young officers, who had once silently accepted injustice, saw for the first time a glimmer of hope that the law was no longer a shield for the arrogant. Mid-level commanders were summoned repeatedly, many faces turning pale, fearing that their own day of investigation was near. The department was shaken, and no one dared to claim their position was untouchable anymore. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, a completely different scene unfolded. The crowd of thousands, who had waited patiently for hours, now burst into prolonged applause. They embraced each other. Some sobbed uncontrollably. Others looked to the sky as if offering thanks for the nameless victims who had once been lost in silence. Many signs were raised, with short but powerful phrases. "Justice has spoken. No more room for abuse." The cheers mixed with the sobs, forming a chaotic but genuine chorus, reflecting the mood of a society that had waited far too long for this moment. Television networks broadcast the scene live, their cameras sweeping across tear-streaked faces, hands raised tightly in celebration. A middle-aged man broke down in tears upon hearing the sentence, his shoulders trembling, telling a reporter that he had once lost faith in the law. Today, that feeling had changed. A young woman hugged her mother tightly, eyes red, whispering that from now on she would feel safe walking the streets. These personal stories, those tears, were no longer isolated emotions, but living proof that justice could reach into the hearts of millions. Amid the sea of people were families carrying portraits of loved ones who had been victims of police brutality. They held the photos high, tears streaming down their faces but faint smiles emerging, because today's verdict was not just punishment for Halper and Grant, but a gesture of comfort for past losses. An elderly woman shakily raised a picture of her son, whispering, "You see, justice finally came." The scene moved many nearby to tears, creating a rare moment of unity as personal grief was eased by a collective victory. The applause never stopped, echoing across the square, stretching long as if to make up for years of silence. It wasn't just a spontaneous reaction, but a declaration that society had crossed into new territory. The tears no longer meant despair, but relief and hope that from now on the law would truly stand on the side of the people. In that crowd, every face lit up as if they had just witnessed the sunrise after a long, dark night. The shock within the police department and the emotional outburst outside the courtroom unfolded in parallel, two opposing sides of the same event. One was fear and anxiety about the future of those who had hidden the truth. The other was joy and tears from people who believed that justice had finally prevailed. And from that contrast, society could see more clearly the powerful message: authority cannot survive without transparency, and public trust can only be built when justice is genuinely enforced. Following the announcement of the verdict, the shockwaves didn't stop at the square or on television screens, but reached into every corner of daily life. Schools across the country began holding special discussions on justice and civil rights. In crowded classrooms, students sat in circles, no longer in typical lectures but in candid conversations about fairness, fear, and hope. A teacher stood at the front, voice slow but weighted. If even the director of the FBI can be disrespected, what chance does an ordinary citizen have? That question echoed, striking the hearts of the children and plunging the room into silence. Hands slowly began to rise. A boy shared how he once saw his father pulled over just for driving an old car in a wealthy neighborhood, and now he understood that injustice isn't isolated. A girl recounted feeling invisible when her peers mocked her for her skin color, but after seeing Anthony Cole stand tall before a gun, she learned that no one has the right to demean her dignity. These innocent reflections brought some teachers to the brink of tears because they proved that the lesson of justice had moved beyond textbook pages and into the lived reality of each child. At universities, forums drew hundreds of students. They didn't just discuss Anthony Cole's case, but asked bigger questions. How must the system change to prevent such failures from happening again? A law student stood up, voice firm. If justice depends on the luck of a random camera capturing the truth, then that's not justice. That's chance. The room burst into applause, creating the energy of a miniature political forum. Professors emphasized that the future of reform doesn't only lie in legislatures, but begins in the consciousness of every generation. The media quickly amplified images of students in dialogue and young people speaking up, turning it into a powerful message to society. Newspapers published short but poignant quotes, treating them as proof that the case hadn't ended with a verdict but continued to live in the minds of the community. One TV network filmed an elementary school class where a white boy said he wanted to stand beside his black friend to show that justice is for everyone. The clip was shared millions of times, sparking hope that a new generation would no longer stay silent in the face of injustice. Social organizations also joined in, hosting open forums in parks, libraries, and churches so people from all walks of life could share their personal stories and listen to one another. At one gathering, an elderly black man recalled his youth when he was beaten by police just for sitting in the front row of a bus. He said, "I thought I would live my whole life in fear, but today, seeing students talk about justice, I believe my grandchildren won't have to bow their heads like I once did." His words left the crowd silent, followed by long applause, as if to etch his reminder from the past into memory. A clear community message began to take shape. Anthony Cole's case did not end with a verdict, but became a mirror for every family, school, and institution. People started teaching their children how to stand tall when insulted, how to speak up when they see injustice, and, more importantly, how to believe in the power of truth. In a nation shaken time and again by division, this moment became a thread of connection, reminding all that justice isn't an abstract concept, it's a shared responsibility. And, from small classrooms, from simple questions, a flame had been lit to guide the way forward. Inside schools, where the air was once still, classrooms turned into lively forums. When teachers opened up discussions, students debated with enthusiasm, voices rising over one another, no longer heads down, taking notes, but eyes bright with passion. A boy stood up, asserting that Anthony Cole's case proved that no one is safe if discrimination still exists, and his classmates responded with applause. A girl countered, saying justice cannot rely on just one high-profile incident, but requires society to fight persistently. The exchanges continued, ideas clashed, but the energy remained constructive, leaving teachers with the sense that they were witnessing a generation learning to shape the world. The spirit of resistance spread faster than any lesson plan. Students began organizing their own after-school discussion groups, hanging posters in hallways, even setting up small bulletin boards to share stories of other injustices they had researched. One group of friends designed posters reading "Justice for All," covering the school in messages of change. When one student worried their actions might be shut down, the group replied in unison, "If we stay silent, we'll be just like those who turned their backs on that rainy night." That honesty emboldened more students to join in. At extracurricular sessions, teachers were surprised to see students taking the lead in discussions, analyzing both legal and ethical dimensions. One male student said that resistance doesn't have to be violent. It can come through unity, through recording, sharing, and forcing others to listen. Another added, "If we live in fear, the next generation will too. But if we rise up, they'll learn how to rise up." These youthful voices, though unpolished, resonated powerfully, sparking hope that change doesn't have to come from the top down, but can take root from the ground up. This momentum didn't stop within school walls. When students shared their debates on social media, thousands of shares helped spread the message of resistance far and wide. Adults were taken aback reading the bold, concise lines written by their own children, realizing this younger generation was no longer just listening, but beginning to speak out for entire communities. Parents attended open discussions held at schools, listening to their children speak. Many were moved to tears by a mix of pride and regret. Regret for the years they accepted silence. Pride because the next generation chose a different path. That spirit of resistance gradually became a shared current, crossing boundaries of race and class. White students stood up for their black classmates. Asian students shared their experiences with discrimination, all uniting around the idea that injustice against one person is injustice against everyone. That atmosphere forced many adults to reevaluate their own indifference as they watched their children take action where previous generations had hesitated. From humble classrooms, this spirit of resistance grew into a smoldering flame, strong enough to reach the broader community. It proved that real change doesn't only come from courtroom verdicts, but from the courage of young minds. And that energy opened a new chapter where belief in justice was no longer a distant theory, but a lived action, passed from students to families, from schools into society, forming an unstoppable current. In the moment when the entire country was still reeling from the footage that had gone viral, Anthony Cole's family finally appeared in public. A special interview was broadcast live, with his wife and son sitting side by side in a modest but sunlit living room. The woman, usually reserved, spoke for the first time, her eyes red but unwavering. She spoke slowly, each word sinking deep into the audience. We were speechless when we saw the video. We couldn't believe that someone like Anthony, with all his dedication and integrity, was treated like a criminal right at his own doorstep. Her voice cracked at the end, and the room fell completely silent. The only sound, the soft click of the cameras. Anthony's teenage son sat close to his mother, his face clearly showing confusion, his eyes filled with both anger and uncertainty. When the reporter turned to ask how he felt, he hesitated, then blurted out, "Dad, why do they hate us?" The question, innocent on the surface, tore through the space with a pain that millions of black families had carried. The air grew heavy. Many viewers watching on screen burst into tears because the boy's question was not just confusion. It was the echo of generations who had faced the same prejudice. Anthony sat beside him, for once showing signs of fatigue after days of maintaining a composed exterior. He turned to his son, placed a hand on his shoulder, and looked at him with an expression meant to pass on strength. He didn't respond immediately. After a deep breath, he said slowly, "Not everyone hates us, son, but some people are afraid of what's different, and when fear turns into hate, they do wrong. What we must do is not let that hate define who we are." The explanation was brief, but it carried the weight of a man who had faced battlefields and now stood in a fight for justice. His wife nodded and added, "We've been silent for too long." That video didn't just break my heart. It reminded me that silence can also help in justice. From now on, I don't want my son to grow up in fear. I want him to know that our family will always stand up for the truth. Their united voices made the interview even more powerful. The cameras captured the moment the three held hands tightly, an image that spread widely online, shared millions of times as a symbol of family and resolve. The press quickly seized on the moment with headlines like, "An ordinary family, a child's question, gave voice to a nation." Social commentators noted that the Cole family's appearance had shifted the case from a legal debate to a human story, where people came face to face with pain and found the strength to move forward. On social media, thousands of comments expressed empathy, and many parents admitted they, too, didn't know how to answer when their children asked the same kind of questions. The tears of the wife, the confusion of the son, and Anthony's calm but firm response once again stirred public emotion. This was no longer just the story of an FBI director, but the story of a family facing the same fear so many others had endured. And in that vulnerability, true strength was revealed. The strength of belief, of family love, and of the hope that children might grow up in a fairer world. Anthony leaned down and wrapped his arms around his son in a hug that was both steady and warm, as if trying to shield him from all the fear in those young eyes. He spoke softly, his voice deep and resonant, because they're afraid of justice. The short reply held a truth many adults still hesitated to admit. Justice, in itself, is no enemy, but for those who thrive on injustice, it becomes a nightmare they seek to bury. In that moment, the boy seemed to understand a part of it, his eyes still brimming with tears, but now less confused, replaced by a flicker of pride from hearing it directly from the father he admired. The image of the three sitting close, hands tightly clasped, was captured by countless cameras and spread everywhere. That family portrait needed no slogans, no lengthy speeches. It became an emotional symbol of kinship and inner strength on its own. People saw in it a resilient wife, a child learning to face truth, and a father who was not only the head of a powerful agency, but also the unwavering anchor of his family. That quiet simplicity moved millions to tears when the image aired across the country. The media called it a healing moment. After days of national tension and outrage, many outlets remarked that a single phrase, "because they're afraid of justice," cut straight to the public's core, offering a clear explanation for the deeper roots of prejudice and abuse of power. Sociologists noted that the Cole family's appearance together served as a powerful reminder that behind every high-profile case are real people with real pain, and they must be protected by a united community. On social media, the image of Anthony's family sitting together quickly became the emblem of the movement. Millions changed their profile pictures to include a frame bearing that phrase, treating it as a vow to keep justice alive. Comments flooded in from those who had experienced injustice to everyday citizens, all finding a part of themselves in that portrait. It was no longer a private moment between family members, but a shared symbol, a reminder that the greatest force against hatred is the unity of people who believe in what's right. The Cole family portrait entered history not through spectacle, but through absolute sincerity. It showed that justice may be tested, may be delayed, but once illuminated by love and truth, it becomes a light the world cannot ignore. As the wave of public outcry had yet to subside, Anthony Cole stepped up to the podium in a hall packed with reporters, politicians, activists, and millions watching live on television. He wore a simple suit. His face still held the familiar cold composure, but his eyes gleamed with resolve. When the microphone lit up, he opened with a sentence that made the entire room hold its breath. "I am not the only victim." The words echoed off the walls, casting a hush over the room. He paused briefly, as if to underscore that behind those words were countless people, pushed into the shadows, unseen and unheard. Anthony spoke in a steady, firm tone, recounting that throughout his career he had received countless complaints from families hurt by abuse of power. He mentioned children who lost fathers, mothers who lost sons, and men who lost their freedom simply because of prejudice. He admitted that even he once believed his position at the top could shield him from such risk, but the recent incident had proven that injustice spares no rank. It seeps into every home, every street. The hall remained silent, and many lowered their heads because the truth spoken by the FBI director could no longer be denied. He then emphasized the urgent matter society was waiting for: systemic reform. We cannot continue to let justice rely on the luck of a camera happening to be rolling. We need a system where every person, whether an ordinary citizen or a high-ranking official, is equally protected. The words cut straight to the core, prompting applause mingled with stifled sobs. He wasn't only calling for changes in the law, but demanding reform in training, oversight, and accountability within law enforcement. Anthony stressed that the responsibility didn't rest solely on the police, but on the entire judicial system and all oversight agencies. He laid out several proposals: strengthening independent oversight, making all arrest procedures transparent, and ensuring complaints are addressed fairly and promptly. Every word he spoke carried the force of someone speaking not just for himself, but for the millions who had endured injustice. Cameras zoomed in, capturing each expression, and his image flooded the front pages by nightfall. The speech ended with a line that brought the entire hall to its feet in prolonged applause. "If I, an FBI director, can have a gun pointed at me and be humiliated on my own doorstep, imagine what ordinary citizens face. I promise you, as long as I hold this position, I will not let the promise of reform be just empty words." The hall erupted with applause, many shedding tears, not out of pity, but because they felt the power of truth and courage. Anthony Cole's speech immediately became a national focal point, replayed repeatedly on television and spreading across social media at lightning speed. People quoted his words, printed them on posters, and shared them in discussions. Experts agreed this marked a turning point, not only in the career of an FBI director, but in the broader movement against discrimination and for systemic reform. And from that moment on, Anthony Cole was no longer just a victim of injustice. justice. He became the voice representing millions who had once been denied justice. Anthony paused mid-speech, his eyes sweeping the audience as if to look directly into each face, making sure they felt the full weight of the truth. He lowered his voice and slowly delivered the line that would later be repeated across the nation. If even I had a gun pointed at me, how many others never had the chance to tell their story? The air in the room seemed to freeze, the silence so complete that the clicking of cameras was clearly heard, until whispers began to ripple through the crowd, followed by a wave of thunderous applause and unified chants for change. That sentence wasn't just a warning, it was a vivid portrait of a long-standing reality, where too many were silenced before they could even speak in their own defense. The media immediately seized on the moment. Major newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, along with leading news channels, all featured Anthony's quote on their front pages. On television screens, white letters stood out starkly against black backgrounds, repeating the line, "If even I had a gun pointed at me, how many others never had the chance to tell their story?" Journalists analyzed the statement not merely as words from an FBI director, but as a painful confession about the fragility of justice, one that the public could no longer ignore. People shared the quote on social media, printed it on banners, and turned it into a rallying cry in the fight for equality. Across the country, communities began organizing small gatherings to read the quote aloud, discuss its meaning, and turn it into a pillar of hope that change was possible. In a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, a group of teenagers painted the line across a crumbling wall, treating it as a vow that they would not stay silent in the face of injustice. In Los Angeles, street artists created a massive mural of Anthony holding up his FBI badge, the quote emblazoned below, forcing anyone who passed by to stop and think. Political leaders could not remain silent. Several members of Congress quoted Anthony's words verbatim in their speeches, emphasizing that it exposed a truth society had avoided for decades. They argued that if the head of the federal security agency could become a target of prejudice, then no citizen could be truly safe under a rotting system. Live broadcasts of the hearings aired nationwide, and each time that sentence was spoken, the public echoed it as a shared call to action. What was remarkable was that the impact didn't stop within America's borders. International media quickly picked up the story, presenting it as undeniable proof of a justice crisis the world could no longer ignore. European newspapers compared the quote to slogans that once ignited civil rights movements of past decades, while African outlets called it a warning from the heart of American power. These analyses further cemented Anthony's words as a legacy the moment they were spoken. On social media, millions commented that they had witnessed or heard stories of similar incidents, but only when those words came from someone in such a powerful position did they feel the personal and global threads finally connect. If he can have a gun pointed at him, then any of us could be next, one user wrote. Post shared hundreds of thousands of times. The reach of this moment turned the sentence into a weapon of conscience, a permanent imprint on the public mind that justice is not an abstract ideal, but a matter of survival. That shocking statement surpassed the scope of a single speech and became a milestone in the movement for accountability. Proved that the voice of one person, when grounded in truth, could resonate as the voice of millions. And from that day forward, when people referred to the case, they didn't just recall the tense standoff in the rain or the FBI badge held up under flashing lights. They remembered the line that sounded like an alarm society could no longer ignore. If an FBI director can have a gun pointed at him, how many lives have already been stolen without ever being heard? After the storm began to settle, the story of Anthony Cole did not come to a close, but instead began a new journey, the journey of turning pain into legacy. Human rights organizations quickly compiled the entire event into educational material, drafting reports and designing training programs for police officers, civil servants, and schools. In international conferences, the image of Anthony holding up his FBI badge in front of a pointed gun was projected on large screens as a reminder that abuse of power does not exist in just one place, but is a global issue that demands vigilance. Numerous reports analyzed in detail how society responded, treating this case as clear evidence of the power of communities in the face of injustice. From that story, a wave of artistic expression spread widely. Street artists painted murals depicting the moment Anthony stood firm in the rainy night, the spotlight casting a glow on his face, giving the image both a heroic and tragic feel. The murals quickly spread, printed on posters, and even appeared in textbooks in certain regions. Music also played a role, as many singers wrote songs inspired by his words, turning them into anthems sung by young people during protests. A group of independent artists produced a short film that retold the events through the perspective of a neighbor girl, adding a fresh emotional angle and highlighting the importance of every witness. What made these works unique was that they did not simply memorialize a call for action, serving as reminders that society must not forget. A play was staged on Broadway, retelling the story while expanding it to include multiple characters, allowing audiences to see that injustice is not random, but the result of an entire system. Thunderous applause after every performance showed that art had become a powerful vehicle to extend the life of the message. Meanwhile, documentary filmmakers from various countries sought out Anthony and his family to record the full scope of the events and present them at international film festivals, offering the world a deeper understanding of the incident. At universities, the story became a subject of academic study. Law students dissected the legal implications, sociology students examined the role of social media, and art students drew inspiration from how communities transformed outrage into creativity. These essays and research projects further amplified the story's impact, transforming the event from a scandal into a real-world lesson for future generations. On a broader scale, many international community movements use the event as a starting point for new campaigns against discrimination and abuse of power. In Africa, numerous social organizations displayed the slogan, "If even I was held at gunpoint," beside Anthony's image. In Europe, human rights groups brought the story into parliamentary forums, using it to emphasize the importance of transparency and accountability. In every place, the story was adapted to the local context, but its core remained the same, a call to protect human dignity. The legacy of Anthony Cole, therefore, does not lie in the position he holds, nor solely in the sentence handed down to those who abuse their power, but in the awakening he and his family brought to society. The paintings, songs, films, and plays all blended into a collective archive of memory, reminding people that justice may be challenged but never disappears. That story became a flame, one that urges every future generation to rise with courage, because silence is the most dangerous thing of all. The younger generation quickly embraced the story of Anthony Cole as a vivid symbol of resistance and resilience. In schools and universities across the country, his image holding up the FBI badge in the rainy night was not only remembered as a striking moment, but also examined in discussions on justice and human rights. Young people looked to him as a role model, believing that courage isn't found in fists or bullets, but in the ability to stand tall and preserve dignity in the face of injustice. They printed his famous quote on T-shirts, stuck it on notebooks, and hung posters in dorm rooms classrooms, turning it into a declaration for their generation. Student-led marches became more frequent, with banners reading, "Justice stands tall," beside Anthony's image, a bold reminder that youth will not accept prolonged silence. That influence did not stop at national borders, but spread across the world. Newspapers in Asia, Europe, and South America all reported on the event, viewing it as clear proof of a global fight against racial prejudice and violence. In many countries, Anthony's story was translated into dozens of languages, featuring television programs and political commentary. Many international scholars compared him to historic figures who changed the course of society because he not only defended himself, but also opened the door for millions to finally see the truth. Human rights movements in many countries drew inspiration from Anthony to build their own campaigns. In Paris, students from Sorbonne University organized a photo exhibition titled "Rainy Night and Justice," showcasing paintings, poetry, and works inspired by his story. In South Africa, a group of street artists recreated the moment on a central city wall, treating it as a call to resist ongoing discrimination. In Brazil, civil society groups used the story to demonstrate that distorted justice is not just an American issue, but something that can occur anywhere power goes unchecked. International forums, from the United Nations to various NGOs, all quoted Anthony's famous line as a prime example of how words can drive social change. The statement, "If even I was held at gunpoint, how many others never had the chance to tell their story," was read aloud at human rights conferences, sparking deep empathy and forcing political leaders to confront their responsibilities. International journalists noted that few events have crossed borders and touched the global conscience as quickly and powerfully as this one. To younger generations, Anthony is not just a high-ranking official, but a symbol that resistance can begin from a simple moment. And when that moment holds truth and courage, it can spread with unimaginable power. And as the story extended beyond national borders, it proved that injustice and the pursuit of justice know no boundaries, both belonging to the shared legacy of humanity. After all the upheavals, from that tense rainy night at the mansion gate to the fiery courtroom trials and the thunderous applause in the square, society finally learned a profound lesson. People realized that justice never arrives on its own. It must be protected, upheld, and nurtured every single day. Without the witnessing eyes, without the brave video that was recorded, without millions of voices rising at once, the truth might have been buried, and Anthony Cole could have become just another forgotten name in a long list of invisible victims. That lesson helped everyone understand that justice isn't some distant concept in a law book. It is a concrete responsibility in everyone's hands. People began to understand more clearly that silence is never neutral. It is complicity. When someone is publicly humiliated and all anyone does is pull the curtains shut, when an innocent citizen has a gun pointed at them and those nearby just look away, that silence becomes the fuel that allows injustice to grow. The Anthony Cole case forced society to look inward and ask how many times they had seen something wrong and said nothing. That painful answer became the reason many decided they could no longer stand on the sidelines, because only when a community speaks together can injustice be driven back. From schools to workplaces, from the streets to the legislature, that spirit spread into a movement. Teachers reminded students that courage doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it's simply saying the right thing at the right time. Parents taught their children that justice isn't a gift from above, but the result of persistence. Family conversations gradually shared the story of that fateful rainy night as a living example that anyone can be the target of injustice and anyone can be the defender of justice. Politicians and social organizations came to better recognize the power of the people. They saw how one seemingly small video could shake an entire system, how one powerful sentence could reach the hearts of millions. Authorities could no longer dismiss public outrage because they understood that yesterday's collective silence had been replaced by a generation ready to question, ready to rise, and ready to protect one another. That lesson became the foundation for further reforms, driven not just by political pressure, but by genuine demand from the community. The story of Anthony Cole does not end with the sentencing of 2 police officers, nor does it stop at slogans on social media. It lives on as a reminder that justice is a flame that must be kept alive by courage, and each individual is its keeper. When society comes to understand that, it ushers in a new era where silence is no longer an option, and speaking out for what is right becomes a shared responsibility. From that shift, the world learns that justice can only survive when people are brave enough to defend it, every day, every moment. The final lesson society draws from this story is the courage to stand up and say no to injustice. No one can believe silence is a safe choice anymore, because silence means allowing wrong to continue. From the image of Anthony Cole facing down a gun in the rain to the unified chants in the streets, every part of it reinforces the truth that the truth itself can only be protected when someone dares to speak. Discussions in classrooms, dialogues in communities, and debates in government all echo the same message. Justice must be sustained by the courage of individuals, no matter who they are or where they stand. The event helped people understand that saying no is not just defiance, it is a declaration of dignity. A student calling out discrimination in class, a worker refusing to stay quiet about unfair treatment, a citizen recording a moment of wrongdoing to expose the truth. Each act is a different face of the same power. It is those quiet yet firm actions that create a wave of change no force can suppress. On social media, young people wrote that they learned from Anthony how to face pressure without bowing their heads. Human rights advocates viewed the event as a foundation to build long-term campaigns. In speeches, the story was told again and again, not to stir up pain, but to reinforce the belief that if one person dares to stand firm, millions more will find courage within themselves. From there, the lesson of dare to stand, dare to say no became a widespread slogan, printed on banners, posted in classrooms, sung in youth anthems, and lived out in the daily choices of citizens. What remains in the end is not legal detail or breaking news, but a conclusion etched into everyone's mind. Justice only exists when people refuse to bow their heads. It is not just a statement, but a collective vow. When millions repeat those words, they remind themselves and each other that justice doesn't live in dry text, but in the actions of each person when faced with wrong. It becomes a shared oath, so every generation to come understands that bowing to injustice is the loss of dignity, and standing tall for the truth is the only way to protect what is right. And from that consensus, society found a new sense of faith. Justice was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible force, fueled by courage and the voice of the community. The story of Anthony Cole, therefore, did not conclude with a legal victory, but opened a long road where citizens understood their responsibility not to stay silent, not to back down. That lesson was engraved as a legacy, so that whenever faced with injustice, people would remember that justice only exists when everyone stands tall, says no, and refuses to bow their heads. The story of Anthony Cole ends like an epic, both fierce and poignant, beginning on a rainy night at the front gate, where he faced 2 officers carrying arrogance and racial prejudice. From their shouting, the gun pointed at the rightful homeowner, to the moment he calmly raised his FBI badge and revealed his true identity, everything ignited a wave of outrage across the community. The video capturing the incident spread quickly. Social media erupted, international press joined in, and public pressure forced the political system to respond. The truth could not be hidden, as each frame and every word laid bare the abuse, exposing those in power and forcing them to stand trial. From public hearings to painful but powerful testimonies, society witnessed the collapse of a protective structure. Halper and Grant were no longer just officers who erred, but symbols of the disease of bias and unchecked power that needed to be eradicated. The heavy sentences they received, along with the questioning of high-ranking officials, affirmed that justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Yet the victory did not belong solely to Anthony Cole. It belonged to the community that raised its voice together, from the neighbor brave enough to hit record to the millions who helped spread the message online. It was that unity that created the power to push injustice back. Anthony, from someone insulted at his own doorstep, rose to become the voice of countless citizens stripped of their right to be respected. When he spoke to the nation and the world, his words, "If I could have a gun pointed at me, how many others never got to tell their story," were not just a reminder, but a wake-up call for every society. The story crossed borders, became an inspiration for human rights movements, and was reimagined through murals, songs, films, and classroom discussions. A younger generation saw him as a symbol, learning from him that resistance can begin with a steady gaze and a clear, unwavering word. The lesson from the entire journey is simple but powerful. Justice does not appear on its own. It must be defended with courage. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and only by daring to stand up and say no can people preserve their dignity. The story of Anthony Cole does not end with a conclusion. It begins a new chapter, where every citizen understands that justice only exists when people refuse to bow their heads. That is the greatest legacy he leaves behind, not only for America, but for all of humanity.